This week, we've been discussing taking up legislation to address the problem of sanctuary cities. In fact, just earlier today, we had a procedural vote on a motion to proceed to actually get on the bill. It failed. It got only 54 votes. The threshold here in the Senate to get on a bill is 60. Democrats here in the Senate decided to block consideration of this bill and to put that 60-vote threshold in play, and as a consequence, it failed. We got 54. I think only 2 Democrat senators voted to proceed to this legislation. And, Mr. President, I would argue that is very unfortunate, because this is a piece of legislation which represents common sense. It represents what I think the American people want us to be focused on when it comes to this issue of dealing with crime in our communities, dealing with the issue of illegal immigration in a way that ensures that those who come to this country and commit crimes aren't allowed to stay here. And right now, according to the Department of Homeland Security, there are 340 jurisdictions across our country that have official policies discouraging cooperation with federal immigration enforcement officers. Among other things, what that means is that these jurisdictions regularly ignore what are called detainers, requests from the Department of Homeland Security to hold an individual for deportation. As a city prepares to release an illegal immigrant who's been convicted of or charged with a crime, the Department of Homeland Security will send a detainer asking that the individual be held for a brief period, usually for 48 hours until federal immigration officers can take custody. In a majority of cities across this country, law enforcement would simply comply with this request and hold the individual until the Department of Homeland Security could arrive. But in sanctuary cities, officials regularly ignore these requests and simply release these individuals from jail back into the population at large, a practice that has resulted in the release of approximately 1,000 undocumented criminals per month. According to information from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 9,295 imprisoned individuals whom federal officials had sought to deport were released into the population between January 1 and September 30th of last year. 9,295 in just 9 months. And of those 9,295 individuals, 5,947, or 62%, had a significant prior criminal history or had presented a threat to public safety even before the arrest that preceded their release. And many went on to be arrested again within a short period of time. Mr. President, there is a terrible human cost to sanctuary cities' decisions to refuse to cooperate with U.S. immigration law. Been a lot of discussion here on the floor about Kate Steinle. Kate Steinle paid that cost when she was murdered on a San Francisco pier while walking with her father on July 1st of 2015. She was shot by an undocumented immigrant who had been convicted of no fewer than 7 felonies. 7 felonies prior to the city of San Francisco's decision to ignore a request from the Department of Homeland Security and then go on and they release this man into the population. And unfortunately, Mr. President, Kate Steinle is not alone. Marilyn Ferris of Santa Maria, California, was raped and then bludgeoned by an undocumented immigrant who had previously been arrested for battery, but had been released after the local sheriff's office decided to ignore a request to detain him until he could be taken into federal custody. A 2-year-old California girl, a 2-year-old, was brutally beaten by her mother's boyfriend, an undocumented immigrant with felony drug and drunk driving convictions, who was released on bail after the crime despite a request from federal officials that he be detained. 2011, Dennis McCann was killed when he was hit and dragged by a car driven by a drunk driver with a blood alcohol content nearly 4 times the legal limit. His killer turned out to be Saul Chavez, an undocumented immigrant with a prior drunk driving conviction. After Dennis McCann's death, the Department of Homeland Security filed a request asking that Immigration and Customs Enforcement be notified if Chavez was scheduled to be released. Cook County, however, chose to ignore this request, and after being released on bail, Dennis's killer apparently fled the country. 4 years later, Dennis's family is still waiting to see justice done. Mr. President, unfortunately, I could go on and on. Decisions to release undocumented immigrants convicted of crimes instead of detaining them for federal officials have resulted in far too many tragedies like those of Marilyn Ferris and Kate Steinle. And too many families in this country are mourning as a result. Mr. President, cooperation between local and federal law enforcement is essential to protecting Americans. And detainer requests from the Department of Homeland Security are a key tool that helps federal officials make sure that dangerous individuals are not going back onto our nation's streets. When cities and counties ignore these requests, they force immigration officers to attempt to track down undocumented criminals after they've been released into the community. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, this requires an exponentially larger expenditure of funds and manpower, and access is not guaranteed. Immigration and Customs Enforcement needs the support of cities and local law enforcement if it's going to keep these individuals off of our nation's streets. Mr. President, the legislation that we've been discussing today would take a substantial step forward, toward ending the threat posed by sanctuary cities. The Stop Sanctuary Policies and Protect Americans Act, which has strong support from law enforcement organizations and victims' families, will withhold federal funds under 3 grant programs and redirect those funds to jurisdictions that comply with federal immigration laws. It will also provide crucial legal protections to law enforcement officers that will allow them to cooperate with federal immigration authorities without the fear of lawsuits. This act also incorporates provisions known as Kate's Law, named after Kate Steinle. These provisions would increase the maximum penalty for illegally re-entering the United States after being deported and create a maximum penalty of 10 years for re-entering the country illegally after being deported 3 or more times. Kate's Law would also create a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for those re-entering the country after having been convicted of an aggravated felony prior to deportation, or for those who re-enter the country after 2 previous convictions for illegal re-entry. Mr. President, what happened to Kate Steinle on that pier in San Francisco should never have happened. And it's likely could have been prevented if San Francisco had chosen to respect the Department of Homeland Security's request to hold her killer until immigration officers could pick him up. I hope that the Stop Sanctuary Policies Act will move forward in the Senate, and that we will be able to send a version of this legislation to the President. It's time that we started ensuring that dangerous criminals like Kate Steinle's killer don't end up back on our streets. And Mr. President, we had that opportunity today. We had a vote to get on this bill. And what's really, truly remarkable and amazing is that we couldn't even get on the bill to debate it. It was blocked by our colleagues on the other side, who prevented even proceeding to the bill. The motion to proceed, which takes 60 votes here in the United States Senate, would have been very easy to get on the bill and at least have that debate. And if they didn't like the provisions in this, have an opportunity to amend it, discuss it, debate it like we should be doing here in the United States Senate. But instead, the Democrats in the Senate chose to block the consideration, even the very consideration of legislation that would go to great lengths, Mr. President, to try and prevent the types of tragedy that we witnessed this last summer with Kate Steinle and so many others who have fallen prey to acts of violence committed by those who are here illegally and had prior experience with the law, prior convictions, clear dangers to people, families all across this country. It's a tragedy that we weren't able to get on the bill. I hope that our Democrat colleagues will change their mind and allow us to proceed to this legislation, to debate it, to vote on it, to pass it, and to send it to the President for his signature.